All right, good evening, everybody. Hi, glad to see you all here. My name is Amalia Weber. I'm the program specialist here at Rochester Hills Public Library, and I would like to welcome you to tonight's program, Legendary Women of Ancient Mesopotamia with Weam Namou. Before we get started, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping details. Firstly, tonight's program will be recorded and available to view about 1 week from tonight on our YouTube page and on the RHPL website shortly after. We ask that audience members please silence or turn off their cell phones before we begin in order to avoid any disturbances during the presentation. We'd also like to thank the Friends of the Rochester Hills Public Library and their many fundraising efforts. It's thanks to their support that we can provide wonderful programming like tonight's presentation. Their next fundraising event will be the Friends of the RHPL 7th Annual Wine, Wit, and Wisdom Fundraiser, which is taking place at the library on Saturday, April 30th from 6:30 to 10 p.m. Participants will attend 2 speaker presentations from a choice of 6 and enjoy a buffet dinner, drinks, a silent auction, and a 50-50 raffle. Registration forms are available at the circulation desk, or you can visit rhpl.org/friends for more information. Our next program is a concert, the Boogie Woogie Kid Matthew Ball, which will be an in-person event this Sunday, March 27th at 2 p.m. You can sign up for that at calendar.rhpl.org. And now, without further ado, please welcome our presenter, Weam Namou.
Thank you, Amelia, and I'm grateful that the Rochester Library invited us to speak today on behalf of the Chaldean Cultural Center. Is this better? Yes. Okay. I'm the executive director of the Chaldean Cultural Center, which is located in West Bloomfield and which houses the world's first and only Chaldean museum. And we have a couple of presentations that we do. We started our presentations in 2019, which with what was called the Mobile Museum, where I went and did presentations at various schools about the Chaldean Museum, which has 5 galleries: the ancient galleries, the Church and Faith, the Village Gallery, Coming to America, and Chaldeans Today. And we did a presentation. We went to the schools to introduce our museum, and then COVID hit. And so we went online. But what I found, I forgot what institution or what university, there was, the opportunities actually expanded because we were being invited by colleges, universities, libraries. But at the same time, people were being more choosy and said, oh, do you have other types of presentations? And I had released a book that is similar to the topics, or this is one of my favorite topics. I had released a book that was called Mesopotamian Goddesses, and I had created a presentation. And so one day I said, well, yeah, we have this one and then we have that. And then I started noticing that most people were picking the Mesopotamian Goddesses, which is great because these stories are ones that I came across I should have come across them a lot earlier than I did, because being born in Baghdad, being of Chaldean origin, and being a writer and a journalist, I really should have been more aware of them. However, I started to slowly discover them because their stories were buried for thousands of years, until about 100 years ago, when archaeologists began to find artifacts and figurines of these goddesses and priestesses. And it all started because I was invited by my niece, who is the president of the Theosophical Society, in 2018. She said, can you come and do a presentation on legendary women of our background? So I did some research. I was aware of a couple, but then I found out more and more of them. And what I found, there was a few of the more popular ones that were more written about, but then others were like slightly written about, and they were just all over the place. And I thought, well, I'd like to bring them into one home, like a book, and so that they're kind of organized and so that their stories are better focused. And starting off, what I found, so these are some of the figurines that were discovered. And if you notice, look at the women's hands. And by the way, this was not just related to women. So worshippers in ancient Mesopotamia, whether they were men women, children. When they posed for, I guess, a statue, they clasped their hands in this way. So they always were like in prayer form. One of the reasons is because they gave all the credit to their works to the gods. And so even though they had these different gods that they had that were representing different types of works, but they did believe in a universal God. And not only did they credit the work to the gods, but they also believed that the way of showing gratitude to the gods is by working. So that was one of the reasons that they invented so many things. So writing was invented in that region. Now, a lot of times, I know that there are civilizations that are older than Mesopotamia, but in ancient Mesopotamia, they documented everything. So we have actual records of how the lifestyle was. So we can have the oldest recipe is on a cuneiform in ancient Mesopotamia. Everything they document, they had receipts, they wrote poetry, everything was written on cuneiforms. But this was all recently discovered, especially with regards to the women's association with that region. What were their contributions? Because prior to about 100 years ago, there was most of the credit was given to the male figures, and the mythology was surrounded around the male figures, and the women were we knew very little about them. So one of the earliest goddesses was the Tiamat, the goddess of the sea, also known as Nama, feminine, and Namou, masculine. And I do not know if we ended up taking that last name from that thousands of years ago. But in Middle Eastern culture, your name always means something, and it's always used. So my name is used in newspapers. Weam is harmony. You will rarely find a name that is not used in the actual language, in literature, in newspapers, when speaking. Niran means fire. And so it's always associated with something. So in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian epic of creation, so Tiamat gives birth to the first generation of deities. Her husband, Apsu, correctly assuming that they are planning to kill him and take his throne, later makes war upon them, his children, and he is killed. Enraged, she also wars upon her husband's murderers, taking on the form of a massive sea dragon. She is then slain by Enki's son, the storm god Marduk. Marduk then forms the heavens and the earth from her divided body. So I'm going to read something. Here about Tiamat. Tiamat's legend has two parts. In the first, she is a goddess who peacefully designs, through a sacred marriage between salt and fresh water, the cosmos by birthing continuous generations. She epitomizes the beauty of the feminine and is described as a glistening one. In the second part, she is considered the monstrous embodiment of prehistoric chaos, often described as a dragon or sea serpent, wreaking havoc on the younger generation of gods. Some even compare her to the Hebrew entity Leviathan. In the Babylonian religion, the Aikido festival was dedicated to Marduk's victory over Tiamat to celebrate the taming of primitive chaos. But originally, Aikido marked two festivals celebrating the beginning of each of the 2 half years of the Sumerian calendar, the sowing of barley in autumn and the cutting of barley in spring. So Robert Grave considered Tiamat's death by Marduk evidence for his theory that there had been an ancient shift in power from a matriarchal society to patriarchy. Grave's ideas were later developed into the great goddess principle by Marija Gimbutas, Merlin Stone, and other writers. This theory suggests Tiamat and other ancient monster characters were presented as former supreme deities of peaceful, women-centered religions and were turned into monsters when violent. Their defeat at the hands of a male hero corresponded to the manner in which male-dominated religions overthrew ancient society. Another goddess is Ninharsag. It's very difficult. Okay, let me see. Okay, is this better? Okay. So the next goddess is Ninharsag, Lady of the Mountains. Ninharsag created both divine and mortal entities and regularly nourished the kings of Sumer with her milk. Historians have noted numerous parallels between myths involving Ninharsag and the Genesis account in the Bible, including the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. The Sumerian story, Enki and Ninharsag, compares greatly to the story of the Garden of Eden in the Bible, with texts describing a paradise similar to Eden, only it was called Dulmun. Dulmun is home for the gods on earth, was created in the winter season. It was a pure and virginal land, clean and bright, where people didn't suffer from disease, headaches, and old age. The land knew peace and didn't need administrations to supervise its people. So I'm going to read from the text that they discovered in the cuneiforms. And this text is Enki and Ninharsag. Pure are the cities, and you are the ones to whom they are allotted. Pure is Dulmun land, pure is Sumer, and you are the ones to whom it is allotted. Pure is Dulmun land, pure is Dulmun land, virginal, pristine. He laid her down all alone in Dulmun, and the place where Enki lay down with his spouse, that place was still virginal, that place was still pristine. He laid her down all alone in Dulmun, and the place where Enki had lain down with Ninkasi, the place where was virginal, that place was pristine. In Dulmun, the raven was not yet cawing, the partridge not cackling, the lion did not slay, the wolf was not carrying off lambs, the dog had not been taught to make kids curl up, and the pig had not learned that grain was to be eaten. When a widow had spread malt on the roof, the birds did not yet eat that malt up there. The pigeon then did not tuck its head under its wing. No eye disease was there. I am the eye disease. No headache was there. I am the headache. No old woman belonging to it, they said, I am an old woman. No old man belonging to it said, I am an old man. No maiden in her unwashed state resided in the city. No man dredging a river said there, it is getting dark. No herald made the rounds in the border district. No singer sang in Abalum there. No wailings were wailed in the city outskirts there. It was in Dulmun that Enki and Ninharsag had fallen in love. The couple became husband and wife. Yet, despite the heavenly state of Dulmun, Ninharsag felt something was missing. Because its soil didn't have fresh water, Dulmun was not yet fruitful. Its fields didn't grow grains and vegetables. So one day she said to Enki, This city has no river, no fields, nor furrow. What good is it for me? He replied, when Utu, the sun god, rises into heaven, at that time fresh waters will run from the standing vessels. As a result of Enki's blessings, so they ended up finding the water started coming in, and then it became fertile land. Interestingly, as the story develops, Enki has some, he becomes unfaithful with his own granddaughter. Well, first with his daughter. What happens is women in ancient Mesopotamia were working women. So after she gave birth to her daughter, Ninharsag, she leaves and she has to tend to many other things. So she leaves her daughter with her husband. When the daughter grows older, the husband misses his wife so much that he sees his wife in his daughter and falls in love with her, and mistakenly he ends up falling in love with his daughter. When his wife finds out, she gets upset at him, she punishes him, but then now he has another daughter, and it's a granddaughter. And then the process keeps going, and which frustrates Ninharsag. Interestingly, I think it was with the great-granddaughter that she tricks him. So the granddaughter and Ninharsag, they plan to punish him for his behavior. And so they take his semen and they plant it in the ground, and from it they have 8 plants. And this is again part of why the resemblance to the story and the Garden of Eden. So she plants 8 plants, and Enki, who does not know why she had planted those plants, he's walking one day and he sees them and he decides to eat from all of them. When she sees this, she is very upset, and so she decides that he's gonna die for this. Interestingly, she wasn't as upset when he was having sex with her children, and one of the things that it was thought of, because she was such a nurturer, that at least with the daughters, they did not die and they continued to live. But when he was eating from the plants, her thoughts are that he is finishing what is going to help the children survive. And so that actually upset her more. And so he got sick from eating all these plants. And she was the only one, and everybody came around and they said, how are we going to heal him? And there was nothing that the gods could do to heal him. She was the only one that could do that. So they went to her and they begged her that she come and she help him revive. And she did. Enki was healed, and 8 healing deities were born, 4 males and 4 females, from his healing. She healed him by sending her soul into his body. So the process went like this. There were 8 parts of Enki that hurt him. First, he says, the top of my head hurts me. She took the infliction into her womb and gives birth to Abu out of it. She continues with this questioning, with him asking him what hurts, with him giving her a different answer. The locks of my hair hurt me. She gives birth to Ninkasi out of it. My nose hurts me. She gives birth to Ningaturt out of it. My mouth hurts me, and so on. So she ended up giving 8 deities, 8 healing deities. Oh, did I press something?
You're good. Yeah,
Okay. Okay. Now, the most famous, Inanna is one of the most famous goddess of ancient Mesopotamia. She is known as Inanna for Sumerians, but later she is known as Ishtar for Babylonians and Assyrians. Inanna is a goddess associated with love, beauty, sex, war, justice, and political power. She was originally worshipped in Sumer under the name Inanna and later by Akkadians and Babylonians as Ishtar. Ereshkigal is Ainana's older sister and the queen of the great earth and the goddess of the land of the dead or underworld in Sumerian mythology. She is said to rule Erkela alongside her husband Nergal. So there's a whole story about Ainana going into the underworld. And there's a lot of spiritual aspects associated with that. What happens is one day she goes to her sister's husband's funeral, and she knocks on the door, and the doorman says, "Ainana, what are you doing here?" And she says, "Well, I'm here honoring my brother-in-law's funeral." And he runs to her sister and says, "Ainana is here. She wants to come in, but she's dressed from head to toe with all these 7, like she's got her crown on, and she's got her beads, and all this fancy stuff." And her sister says, well, for her to go into the underworld, she's going to have to take off these things. She's going to basically have to let go of all these ego-associated materialistic items. And so the doorman tells Ainana, you can come in as long as with each passage that you go through, each gate, you have to remove. First, you have to remove your crown, then you have to remove your wig, and then piece by piece, she has to remove different items before she can go into the underworld. And she says to him, well, what is this for? Why am I doing this? And he says, you cannot ask questions when it comes to the underworld. This is what you have to do. And usually with anything regarding the underworld and having that association with death, that is a world that is shamans are known to be masters at. And this is what Rhpl was about. It was about taking somebody from one side of themselves, being king or president. So if you are, we know of many presidents that will be on the top of, on the top of everything, and then they are taking down. And that's actually supposed to be a spiritual experience where they transcend everything that they thought they were about into the underworld. They go through their death, through a spiritual death, and come out on the other side. So when Ainana goes into these, gives up all these materialistic things, she ends up into the underworld, and then her sister is there to meet her, and she basically tells her, you have been living this kind of lifestyle, and then now you've come to the underworld for a reason, and it's for your death. So Ainana, before she had gone on this journey, she had told her assistant, she said, if I don't come back in 3 days, go to this and this person and see whoever can help come and get me. So in the underworld, they decide that, they're going to kill her. And so she's hanging there. The servant realizes that hasn't returned in 3 days. So he goes and asks for help. And then they send somebody to go and ask and say, we want her back. Well, the way they kind of tricked themselves in there and became healing powers for her sister. And then she said, oh, you've helped heal me. I wasn't feeling good. And she says, I will give you anything that you want. And he says, well, what I want is Ainana. And she says, well, if I'm going to let Ainana go, then somebody has to come and replace her. So they said, okay. Well, and they said, and we can't trust that she's going to go and come back. She's going to go and bring somebody. So we will send some demons with her. So, okay, Ainana leaves. She's walking out. The first person that sees her is her servant. He is so excited, and he comes, oh my, Ainana, you've come out. And so the demons say, well, how about we take him instead of you? She says, oh, no, he's the one that saved my life. And then they keep walking along, and they come to her sons. And they say, how about them? We'll take them. And she says, no, these are my sons. I totally adore them. You can't take them. So then she goes along, and then she comes to this tree where she used to go and meditate a lot, and she sees that her husband is partying there. So he got his throne through her. She initiated him because in ancient Mesopotamia, it was the goddess that initiated the king into his throne. So he's partying. He didn't even do the ritual of grieving for a certain period of time or anything like that. So she decides, well, you know what? You can take him. That's fine. So they take him, and then he goes into the underworld, and she's happy and everything is well. But then one day she's walking in the market. She runs into his sister and his mom, and they're wailing and they're crying. And she feels bad because this man, she loved him, and they had a relationship, and she doesn't want to leave him in the underworld for too long. And so his sister says, Ainana, if you will agree, I will spend half the time in the underworld, and he only the other half of the time. So Ainana agrees, and then he comes out. But in this whole process, the whole point of the story is that when you have the female deities in this whole process, first of all, it was a spiritual death because they are going underneath, they're discovering their darkest side. They're probably letting go of a lot of their egos, and these are the kind of experiences that we have when we are going through something that's like trauma or something that's very, very sad. So, but the interesting thing is that when the female deities were in charge of this, they always put their hands in and brought the person back to life. There was a sort of anger and there was a sort of rage, but then it always kind of came back to where, okay, I'll bring him back to life, whereas the complete death and destruction that occurred with Tiamat. So that's the story of Inanna and Rhpl. Then this one is really fun. Ninkasi, she's the goddess of beer. So the oldest recipe in the world of beer, well, and food too, but is in ancient Mesopotamia. So one day I was giving a tour for the students from Adana University. I was giving them a tour in the museum. And I remember a student saying to me, I was explaining why Chaldeans owned stores when they first came to this country for many reasons, including the fact that, when you don't speak English, and even if you're a doctor, you can't use your degree basically here for many of the things. Furthermore, when we came from Iraq, most of the time we couldn't bring anything with us, depending on who was in power. And in our case, when we came, Saddam was in power. You can't bring anything with you, so you come from zero. And so you take jobs that you can. You serve food, and so you can look at a can of corn and figure out what that is, right? You can bring your children to the store, and they'll translate for you. You can make them start picking up they go to school, they pick up very quickly. Like we didn't know anything except yes and no, and we picked it up just like this, the English language. And so the next thing I know, I became my parents' interpreter and translator. And everything, you make the calls for the doctor's appointments and everything like that. So the store business, and plus they came from a land where they were familiar what it is to be merchants. So in the Stele of Hammurabi, from that time, from thousands of years ago, they had laws regarding economy, and they were very familiar with businesses. Another thing is they were good with money. The shekel was invented in Babylon. So sometimes people wonder, oh, how come? I had somebody ask me, we heard that Chaldeans don't pay taxes. I said, oh, you really? I don't know. We've always, we've paid taxes. And that was news to me. So then I always, when I get questions that I don't know how to answer, I go and investigate. And so I heard the story behind that. But there's a lot of misconceptions because of our relationship with money. But our relationship with building and money is thousands of years old. We have a good relationship with money because it was started as a way of trading with items. But back to Ninkasi. So the student wanted to know, okay, well, so you have stores. Why liquor stores? I said, well, so Christians are allowed. We're Christian Iraqis, and Chaldeans were converted to Christianity in the first century, and by St. Thomas the Apostle, because he was passing through Mesopotamia on his way to India. But we are allowed to sell liquor in the Middle East because we're Christians, except when there's certain situations going on and then that becomes a target. But we always also, historically, we had relationships with liquor and beer. And it was used in poetry as long as you used it in modesty, just like with food or anything else. And I don't know how much people listened, but beer was considered a healthy drink, healthier than water. And so they gave rations to everybody. The men got a certain amount, the women got a certain amount. Depending on the job that you had certain amounts. And children were also given beer, again, because it was considered healthier. Now, Ninkasi was the goddess, and she had priestesses that would brew the beer every single day. And the way they learned about her is because there's a prayer song that was created because people didn't know how to read and write, except like the priestesses and the priests and priestesses and goddesses. And so every single day they would repeat this same poem, the same words, in order that they don't forget the recipe. And it was just a beautiful song that they would use, and then they would brew the beer every morning, just like we make like fresh bread in the bakery every day. So beer was brewed every day, fresh beer. And so she was the goddess of beer. Now, this is my favorite person. And this person, I discovered her first thing before anybody else. This is Enhadwana. In 1927, British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley discovered the Enhadwana Selkut disk during excavation of the Sumerian city of Ur. So she's the first recorded writer in history, not the first male or female, the first writer. Now, it's not because she's the first that ever wrote, because there were many writings before her. But traditionally before her, people did not sign their name. But Enhadwana decided that she does want to sign her name, that she does want to make history. And so at the end of her poetry, she would sign, "It is I, Enhadwana, who wrote this, something my king has never done before." She wrote 42 poems, and her father was a king, King Sargon of Akkad, and he put her as high priestess in Ur, Ur is in southern Iraq, and that's where Chaldeans, they trace their roots to Ur, because it was Ur of the Chaldees, and this is another reason they trace their roots to Prophet Abraham, because he was from Ur, land of the Chaldees. But this figure, I came across her name accidentally, and part of that reason is because she's not honored in her own land, for one. So when the British archaeologists discovered her, there was a couple of Western women, one in particular, who just took this information, and this was in the 1970s, who tried her best to go around, write books about her, give talks about her, to show the importance of her work. Because Mesopotamians, what they did, regardless if they were writers, if they made beer, if they built buildings, whatever they did, there had to be more of a purpose than self-expression. Although she was the first to use the I to express herself. But her purpose was, when her father was trying to take two empires, he wanted her to build peace and harmony between the two empires through poetry. So they actually used poetry to bring peace and harmony between the people, and that was her job, among many other things, like maintaining the temples. This is her right there. So she commissioned a disc that shows her and her entourage. She was, unfortunately, when there was, during war, she was exiled from her city, and then through prayers that she wrote to Inanna, begging for, to be placed back into her position, she eventually was returned, but she didn't have the same status as she did before. I actually, before I go to the next person, I usually have like a smaller version of her poem, but I have the longer version here, so okay, I'll see if I have a different one. Okay. The next female, which, I want to say that this was the Queen Kobaba. She was the only woman among the list of Sumerian kings. And she was so famous and she was so peaceful that later they gave her the title of goddess. So these goddess figures, those were titles at that time. And it was just like a hierarchy of names, like goddess and priestesses. Same thing with gods, and then priests and kings and so on. And each one had a different job. So she was a successful businesswoman. She was a bartender, basically. Again, going back to beer, it was actually, at that time, it was a very respected profession. But she was a successful businesswoman and successful queen. Kobaba's kindness caused the god Marduk to give her royal dominion of all lands. So after her reign ended, story has it that she went back to being the alewife, feeding local fishermen who lived near the house. Kobaba was later worshipped as a goddess. Unfortunately, in later generations, Mesopotamians decided it was unnatural for women to uphold traditional roles for men, and provided this omen to make sure no woman dares to improperly cross that line again. If an androgyny is born with both rod and vagina, omen of Kobaba, who ruled the country of the king shall be ruined. So after Kobaba, there was never again a woman that ruled in that region. And it's interestingly that I think it was her absence that actually ruined that region. Another very important figure was Gula, the great healer. Gula was initially Gula was a Sumerian deity known as Bau, goddess of dogs. Her cylinder seals portray her always with a dog, sometimes seated and surrounded by stars. Her son, Ninazu, carried a rod entwined with serpents. This symbol was adopted by the Egyptians, later the Greeks, and today one sees the Sadducees in doctors' offices and medical practices around the world as the sign of Hippocrates, the father of medicine. A cult center for Gula, the city of Isin is thought to have served as a training center for physicians who were assigned to temples in different cities as needed. Medical books from the library of Ashurbanipal indicate that doctors had remarkable amount of medical knowledge and applied this repeatedly in caring for their patients and appeasing the gods and the spirits of the dead. People accredited this knowledge to Gula as a gift from the gods. So, in ancient Mesopotamia, they had two types of doctors. One that was specifically for the physical ailments, and one for the spiritual one. And they worked hand in hand without one being higher or lower than the other. And they worked together on patients. So if they came to see a patient who had a headache, the one that was looking at the spiritual one, or the one that dealt with the spirits, would try to see what is ailing this person outside of the physical pain of that headache. Whereas the physical doctor would try to see what is it physically that's ailing. So this was their common practice in ancient times. So they didn't rely on only one or the other. And interestingly, when I found this about the dogs, so, when you look at that region and women's involvement and some of the things that have been not only omitted, but made kind of either demonic or dark or dirty. Dogs are one of those things. So I thought, well, that is interesting because other pets, except for the pig, but dogs in particular in the Middle East are not looked as pets. Things have been changing in attitudes, but it is not the same attitude as in Western countries. And that's because there's, I think there's like a verse in Islam that says something about dogs not being clean. And when I discovered some of these goddesses, I noticed that some of the things that are particularly not welcomed were associated with females, including the dog, which they said that she did not go anywhere without the dog, and in all her statues there was a dog always beside her, because they considered that dogs were had so much healing power. The status of female deities began to diminish during the reign of Hammurabi, and afterward when male gods dominated the religious arena. That wasn't the case with Gula, however, whose worship remained with the same respect. Adoration for Gula continued well into the Christian period, and in the Near East, Gula was as prevalent as many well-known deities. Her cult declined little by little, and by the end of the first millennium, she had been forgotten. So this is a little bit of a history, but Maria Theresa Esmar, she's not as ancient as some of the other women that I had shared information about. But she was another woman that is rarely discussed, and when I came across her book, it's a 2-volume memoir that's over 700 pages. Again, nobody really addresses her or highlights her work, and so we don't have the opportunity to see a version of that region that's non-stereotypical. So this woman, she was a Chaldean Catholic from the village of Telkepe. So facing tremendous obstacles, Esmar, she set up a school for women in Baghdad and welcomed with open arms Western Christian missionaries, who then bribed the Turkish government to give them a license for the school and forbid Maria to carry on with her project. She was left frustrated and angry to have been treated this way by fellow Christians, and she sought sanctuary with the Arab Bedouins. So she set about recording their daily lives, everything from the wedding and celebrations to their assaults on other tribes. She explained in great detail the Bedouin life. But she also, when she traveled to European countries, and she was, Queen Victoria of England actually sponsored her and her book and her work, and Esmar mentioned that in the acknowledgement section. It was in the early 19th century that Maria wrote Memoirs of a Babylonian Princess, which consists of a volume of 720 pages. They don't know in what language she originally wrote it, but it is available, and it was published in 1844 in London in English. So she paid close attention to women's issues and fought for their rights. Her main concern was education and respect between the sexes. So I want to read a few of the poetry of Enhadwana. I'll try to just be closer to the microphone. Because one of the things about her and others who had written poetry and literature is the amount of sophistication. It makes you really wonder that how did their mind work this way? Within a couple of thousand years, it might seem like a long time, but in southern Iraq, in southern Mesopotamia, And by the way, Mesopotamia was changed. The name was changed to Iraq in 1921 when the British occupied Iraq. And unfortunately, so what that has done, so it makes Mesopotamia seem just like that's one part of the world and Iraq is a different part of the world, but they are one and the same parts of the world. And so Ur still exists. The ziggurats still exist in ancient Iraq. And the ziggurats were like, I guess, like the Vatican. So it was this huge temple that resembled it. It doesn't look like a pyramid. It's closer to the Mayans, the buildings that the Mayans had, with the way the structures were. And they believed that the closer you were to the sky, that the closer you are to God. And then the priests and priestesses lived there, and they were the mediators between the people and the gods. But it was like the Vatican in that it was like it had its own world. It had its own justice system. So they had a goddess for justice, and they had the goddess Gula, who they had medical beds there, and they had everything that's provided for the people. A little bit further from that were the Marsh People. And the Marsh People, it's kind of like the Venice of Iraq. So there's no ground or anything like that, and people use canoes to get from one, and the homes are built out of straws. And it's still like this from thousands of years ago. The Marsh People, Saddam had tried to destroy that area when they tried to do an uprising against him. But as much as they have tried to destroy it, it still exists. The Marsh People still exist from thousands of years ago. And so archaeologists believe that they are the same people related to the Sumerians. So their gods and goddesses all have this role, and then they had the ziggurat that helped all that communication. And prior to building all of this, the people were nomads. The Sumerians, they don't know exactly, they were hundreds of tribes that were going there, were hunter-gatherers. And they would go around and wherever food was. So suddenly, when they discovered the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and the Euphrates, they settled down. They were able to have food. So what happens really when we have a more relaxed lifestyle, we are fed, we feel safe, then the imagination can work. So very soon, they started creating all these and building the ziggurats and different buildings and creating things that there's tons and tons and thousands of cuneiforms that we haven't even come across. So there's probably more to discover. Well, they have discovered them, but they can't catch up with them with translating and seeing the stories that existed there. But it was very evident from the way they had, the males always had, and females always had a consort. So there was male, female deities always together. There was what looked like an equal amount of female and male energy. And so there was more of a balance and harmony in that sense. And when you are listening to their poetry or their writings, you don't see the male-female type of tension as much as other things that are going on amongst their stories. So the female having the kind of power that they did, where the goddess initiated the king into his throne, that was just the common thing. So it wasn't issues that we have now between the sexes. Also, I want to say something about this story. I know so much about these stories, so sometimes it's I might not say them in order, but Enhadwana's father, Sargon, he has a story where his mother put him in a basket, put him on a river, sent him off away. He ended up in Ishtar's palace, where the gardeners got hold of him, raised him to be a king. So the stories and their similarities, there's so much there, and there's so much significance when you start reading. It's just you want to go deeper and deeper into the stories before the stories. I'm just going to read a part of this. There were many battles during the politically turmoil time. Naram Sin fought 9 battles in 1 year. So this is what led, and he tries to win Enhadwana's support, to become legitimized by her by bidding against her nephew. He needs to be legitimized by her. But she rejects him. So he removes her from her position as high priestess. She's called from Ur to another temple, and he claims that the god Nana had spoken that the city belonged to him and his servant. In exile, Enhadwana turns to the goddess Inanna to regain her position through prayers, song, holy words, and religious rites to alter the situation. One of the poems is called The Exaltation of Ainana. It was in your service that I first entered the holy temple. I, Enhadwana, the highest princess. I carried the ritual basket. I chanted your praise. Now I have been cast out to the place of lepers. Day comes and the brightness is hidden around me. Shadows cover the light, drape it in sandstorms. My beautiful mouth knows only confusion. Even my sex is dust. So the stories, and here I have, let me see how many goddesses. So even in Arabia, there were the 3 goddesses, and one of them, which the wife of Prophet Muhammad, Khadija, belonged to one of them, and that is why she was such a powerful woman. She was 15 years his senior. So the stories again of how women were in the past. So there were regions that were problematic towards women. However, she in particular was 15 years his senior, twice a widow, a very wealthy, successful businesswoman, and she proposed to him. So she had a very powerful position, and that was before Islam. So that kind of power existed. There was 3 deities, 3 that they consider the pagan deities that were female. They were called the 3 trinities. And the 3 trinities were Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. And Khadija belonged to one of them, and that is part of what gave her so much power during that time. So really the list of female deities, queens, and priestesses are long. And it's obvious from the position they had that early on women were respected and highly visible. Unfortunately, their participation in the building of the cradle of civilization was omitted from our mythology until their stories resurfaced in the late 19th century through cuneiform fragments. This omission has had dire consequences on our world, especially for our daughters who rarely get a chance to view a version of themselves that's relatable and inspirational rather than stereotyped and pigeonholed. these are some of the references that I used for here. I mean, even the whole Ninkasi, when she was healing her husband after he ate from the plants, one of his daughters, she had her specifically, she made her from his rib. And later the story changed from a female deity being created from a rib to women, rather than having the natural giving birth, became that the man gave birth to the woman. So even that power was taken away from her on a physical level. So her powers from that region were taken away from her, whether it was through, not having the dog suddenly becoming dirty, rather than her giving birth, which that's what she was credited for, and that she was considered the creator, and that is why she was the one that initiated the king, to her being born from a rib. And so the narrative over time has changed. But when you look at their stories and see that the power that she had, and the males as well, but they were more on equal footing. So that when you are reading their literature and the poems between them, they're really more fun than even today, when sometimes we are so absorbed by sadness and negativity. So maybe I want to open it up for questions, if anybody has any questions. Yes. So the Sumerians were the people from the southern part of Iraq, and they're the first known people that had a language, the Sumerian language. And there was different empires, but the 5 major empires of ancient Mesopotamia are the Sumerians, the Akkadians, which Enhadwana, Sargon were Akkadian. You have the Babylonians, which Hammurabi was the king of the Babylonians. Then you have the Assyrians, and then after the Assyrians are the Neo-Babylonians. And the Chaldeans have their major achievements associated with the Neo-Babylonians. Yeah. Sumer, yes. Yep, it was in southern Iraq, southern Mesopotamia at the time, yes. Well, I was focusing on the woman.
You named 5 empires. You didn't mention the Chaldean Empire.
Oh, I see. Well, the Neo-Babylonian Empire is considered, we consider that Chaldean's empire. Yeah.
It's called Chaldean Empire. Why we call it? Okay, anyway.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I'm not like an archaeologist, and I don't know about the terminology, but I think for purposes, when we built the museum, what we did is we got a lot of historians involved so that we could see, I guess, the accurate terms that were used during certain time periods, and I think they used the Neo-Babylonians. So, yeah. But they did call Nebuchadnezzar that he was a Chaldean, he is a Chaldean king, so I see what you're saying, yeah. And he built the Hanging Gardens, which is one of the 7 wonders of the world. So interestingly, again, they built so many things that we can't describe today because there's no evidence of the Hanging Gardens. And similarly, there's no real evidence of the Tower of Babel. So they think that maybe the ziggurats were the Tower of Babel because they have that similar concept. So there's still so much there to figure out, including the idea that in the cemetery of Ur, they found so much enormous gold. So there's no gold in Iraq. There's no gold in Mesopotamia. So where did they get this gold from? So archaeologists said, well, they don't know exactly, but they assume that from maybe Afghanistan, India, other neighboring countries. But then, while the Mesopotamians did invent the wheel, so did they use that little wheel? We only have evidence of this small carriage. Did they use that carriage or a sailboat to get to these countries, to get the gold, bring it back, and make all this gold, and within a time to serve their kings and queens and to be able to bury them? How did they travel such long distances? You know, this is why until today, people are so fascinated about that region, and the History Channel has gone and focused more so on all these extraterrestrial involvement because they don't have the answers. Well, I mean, it might seem funny, but at some point you think like, even I want to show you, like they had, if you look into their, let me show you, I have to go back here. It was interesting in their dress and how they dressed, and also some of the ways they presented themselves, like the wings and the feet and all the ways with the animals is associated. We don't really have an understanding what did this symbolize, and what did they see, or even in this case with the dragon, and there were some descriptions in there that did not exist. For instance, when Ainana goes into the underworld, she says, I'm going to take the 7 me. She doesn't say, I'm going to take the 7, my crown and my this. She says the 7 me, which stands for the things that give her power. So they had a very intimate self-knowledge, self-consciousness, which in the West, and this is why the West is successful today, we do have that. And that was taken away from the Middle East, where our powers, or the person's powers, are totally taken away to only a higher being. But at that time, she says, I am taking the 7 me. That's what she called them. And so there was an inner knowledge of their higher powers. And they used it to their fullest abilities, it seems, from what we were able to see that they were able to create. Any other questions? Yes. Well, it happened gradually, but there was more emphasis on the fact that Hammurabi, in his writings and some of their laws, that the shift went, there seemed to have been more preference for male gods over female gods. The shift was more, I think, obvious. It might have been over time, but the shift was more obvious during his ruling. Yes. That gave her power? Yeah, well, I know there was a crown, and then there was her, like a little work that she had. She had mascara, and she had a necklace. Yeah, it actually says that she had her mascara on, and she had a necklace, and a rod, and I believe there was something around her waist. Yeah, a belt, yeah. And she had to remove each one of those in order to go in. And then she gives a poem. She makes a poem for her sister, thanking her and honoring her for experience. Her sister who put her through this death, because she realized that it was in her death that she discovered herself. And so she writes a poem to honor her sister for that experience. Any other questions? Yes. There's a much more in my book, yeah. Sometimes because normally, especially when we started going online, and there were corporations that would, during their lunch, that would have me do their presentation, so it was normally an hour. But there are so many goddesses in here, and there are so many texts that have the similarities to biblical texts. Okay, here's another text that was, this is Ninshubar tells Ainana, that was her assistant, that when the boat enters the gate of Uruk to let high water flow in the city, and to let the deep-going boats sail swiftly through the canals. I mean, look at all this language and these boats that they had, which he said, pile on this and put this in the boats. And it sounded like the Titanic. You know, all this is like, oh, this is a huge boat during that time. There was also stories, which the story of Ishtar is very, very interesting. So I'll read a little bit of this story, but then regarding Ishtar, the story between her and Gilgamesh and the flood, the story of the flood. If you look at the original text of Gilgamesh epic, that in itself is really, really an amazing text. So on the day the boat of heaven enters the Nugala gate of Uruk, let high water sweeps over the streets. Let high water flow over the paths. Let the old men give counsel. Let the old women offer heart-soothing. Let the young men show the might of their weapons. Let the children laugh and sing. Let all of Uruk be festive. Let the high priest greet the boat of heaven with song. Let him utter great prayers. Let the king slaughter oxen and sheep. Let him pour beer out of the... here we go with the beer again. I think most of us would have had fun during that era. Let the drum and tambourine resound. Let the sweet Tiji music be played. Let all the lands proclaim my noble name. Let my people sing in my praise. And so it was. That was her request. That was Inanna when she was able to swindle this boat from her father after they had this like drinking match. And you know, and interestingly, as I said, the texts are more playful than what we find later on in their stories. And there's really hardly any violence. So you actually have fun seeing how she gets the boat from him. But then when she does receive it, she uses it for good, because when she takes it to the other side and he's trying to keep it, and interestingly, he too blesses her. He blesses the process rather than damning her for having been able to take it. So they understood the match that they were doing, and they honored each other for winning, kind of like in the Olympics. So again, showing the type of equality where he allowed her that she was able to outsmart him, and he honored that. But she did it for the goodness of the people. She didn't do it to create any kind of destruction. Later, you see the behavior towards women in the Babylonian and with the Hammurabi, but also with how Gilgamesh, not only by the way how he treats Ishtar, he kind of like, he wasn't very kind to her, basically, when she was trying to come and try to initiate him or try to get closer to him. But the behavior that he showed her was not normal, what you would show a goddess. He disrespected her. So it was already going in that direction. Interestingly, his behavior towards nature, he goes into the forest and he kills the man in charge of the forest. So during the same time that he was pushing her out, and the whole, almost there's like a sense of destruction of the feminine as well as nature, because her and creation, and she's such a strong part of nature and birth. But at the same time, he kills the man that's in charge of the forest. So there was a couple of negative things, and then the flood occurs, and then he wants to be immortal. That's what he's after. And in pursuit of that, the flood happens, and then he tries how to see. And the whole Noah of Ark story, you see it in there, but in a different version of it. Yeah. There's a book called, I don't think I have it as a reference here, but it's called the Chaldean Book of Genesis. And there was a British archaeologist that went to Nineveh in the 1800s. And he did a lot of research and found a lot of material on Chaldeans and Babylonians that was in the Assyrian library. that he felt like people needed to know about. And again, I don't know how much of it was or has been translated.
Is your book only about women of Mesopotamia?
Well, generally, because they did have male figures, so like I said, they had husbands. The goddesses had got their god spouse, and the men had women wives. So their husbands are naturally included. Ainana's husband, I think Ninkasi was one that I don't remember her having a spouse, and Enhadwana did not get married. She was a priestess. But the earlier story of Tiamat, she was married. And so there's information about her husband, her spouse. Ninharsag has, I believe it is Ninharsag, that whole Adam and Eve story in the Garden of Eden has the first poem in history was found in ancient Mesopotamia. First love poem, I'm sorry. The first poem to what? The first love poem. And I believe the one that they were talking about, that I only discovered in this last Valentine's Day, was the one with Ninharsag. Inanna Ereshkigal had a husband. There was a that seemed like the natural state of things, is that males and females had partners of the opposite sex. Yeah.
What's the name of the book again?
So it's Mesopotamian Goddesses, and I did bring some copies if anybody's interested. I finished a novel, something I hadn't done for a while. I started off as a novelist, but then I started into nonfiction. But I wrote Pomegranate as a script. It was selected quarterfinalist by Francis Coppola Zoetrope, and it was turned into a film currently in post-production. And the third book won an Eric Hoffer Award. It's a nonfiction, and it has documentary that won a couple of international awards. So if anybody's interested in any of the books, or if you want to just Google my name, and you can get anything from Amazon. But somebody, a PhD candidate, I didn't realize this. I'm always finding things out, which it's fun. But he contacted me about Pomegranate because he wanted to do a dissertation about the Iraqi-American experience. He's in England, but he's Iraqi and he's studying in England. And he said, I'm looking for authors and I want to write about the Iraqi-American experience and identity. So he asked me for help. He said, well, they're going to use the book Pomegranate. He said, but I want other authors, and if you can help me also maybe find a male author. And him and I had such difficulty because even the Iraqi authors either mostly wrote about history, like a historical account of something, or what was the other thing? Or they would write about Iraqis in Iraq, not the Iraqi-American experience. Even though, right now, and I don't know if you guys know this information, I found this out from Senator Andy Levin, is that Michigan has the largest population of Iraqi-born citizens. Well, Michigan also has the largest in the U.S. Michigan also has the largest population of Chaldeans in the world. We were the second largest up until 2014, what happened with ISIS. But today we're the largest community in the world. And it has the largest population or concentration of Arab Americans. So this place is really like our home, and we came here for a purpose, and I think that the purpose is to be able to continue on what women and men, regardless, with the history that was destroyed in that region. I believe that we came here to be able to continue it so that it's not really dead. We are sharing it and keeping it alive in a different way. Yeah. And that's why we call and consider this, for us, it's very sacred ground that we were able to create that shift. How interesting that these stories, that these women, the men, all the stories that resurfaced that are not wanted over there, but they are wanted over here because obviously by having an audience that's obvious and being requested to do presentations. So we're very, very grateful as the Chaldean Cultural Center or as the community. Thank you very much. Thank you.